Can we finally agree that this is some Nazi-ass shit?
Yes, we can, because this is some Nazi ass shit. Not just the type of information that they're destroying, but the fact that they're using radicalized young men to destroy it. Let's talk about the 1933 raid on Berlin's Institute for Sexual Science. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Magnus Hirschfeld established the Institute for Sexual Science in 1919 in Berlin, which at the time had a thriving queer subculture. His goal was to establish a place of research, healing, teaching, and refuge that would free the individual from physical ailments, psychological afflictions, and social deprivation. It was a nonprofit foundation that was part research center, part museum and archive, part boarding house, and part medical clinic. The institute functioned sort of like a proto-Planned Parenthood, offering sex education, contraception, counseling, and medical treatment, in addition to providing gender-affirming care for trans people. Hirschfeld's motto, "Through Science to Justice," was inscribed on the building. In addition to being one of the most influential sexologists of the 20th century, Hirschfeld was a passionate advocate for LGBT rights, specifically for the repeal of paragraph 175, the German law that banned sex between men. Hirschfeld himself was gay, but he was radicalized into political action by a patient, a young army officer who took his own life in 1896 because of the overwhelming guilt and shame he felt for being gay. He addressed his suicide note to Hirschfeld and closed it by saying, "The thought that you could contribute a future when the German fatherland will think of us in more just terms sweetens the hour of my death." Hirschfeld would go on to speak often about the dangers of suicide in the queer community and was the first to present statistical evidence that queer people were more likely to take their own lives. He was also a feminist who believed that women's rights and queer rights were interconnected. As such, he campaigned to decriminalize abortion, to lift the ban that prevented women working as civil servants and as teachers from marrying and having children, and he was part of a successful action to block an amendment to paragraph 175 that would have criminalized sex between women. All of this, combined with his Jewishness and his belief that homosexuality was just a normal and natural variation in the human experience, made Magnus Hirschfeld an exceedingly controversial figure in Germany. In the 15 years leading up to that failed painter becoming chancellor, Hirschfeld went from being side-eyed and shrugged off for his progressive views to being upheld as a symbol for the decadent, effeminate, un-German culture that the Nazis believed themselves to be fighting against. Hirschfeld was beaten so badly by a mob in Munich in 1920 that he was accidentally declared dead. When it turned out that he was alive, newspapers lamented that his skull hadn't been properly crushed. His work, his sexuality, and his Jewishness were all used against him, and Hirschfeld became the literal poster boy for what Nazis called degenerate Jewish sexuality and extreme Jewish intellectualism. So it's perhaps not surprising that the Institute for Sexual Science was one of the first targets once that failed painter came to power. The raid was organized by the Berlin chapter of the German Student Union, a group of bright-eyed and radicalized, college-aged white men. Student groups did a lot of the heavy lifting for the Nazi cultural genocide in Germany in the 1930s, and it was the GSU that conducted most of the book burnings in Germany. Shortly after that failed painter came to power, the GSU's press office put out a call for a nationwide action against un-German spirit that should culminate in a literary purge and cleansing by fire. On the morning of May 6, 1933, members of the GSU marched on the Institute for Sexual Science. They brought a brass band with them so they'd have an appropriately patriotic soundtrack as they broke down the doors and looted or destroyed everything they could get their hands on. Tens of thousands of items, including irreplaceable medical and anthropological research. When they were finished, the leader of the group gave a speech, and then they all sang the Nazi anthem. Later that day, Ernst Röhm's stormtroopers showed up to loot or destroy anything that the students had missed in their zeal. 4 days later, on May 10, 1933, a bronze bust of Magnus Hirschfeld that had been taken from the Institute was paraded through the streets of Berlin to a public square, where somewhere between 10 and 25,000 books and files and magazines, not just from the Institute but also from local libraries, bookstores, and universities, were piled high. The bonfire was lit before a cheering crowd of 40,000 people, and students continued to throw books into the flames as Joseph Goebbels gave a rousing speech about the strong, great, and symbolic deed of entrusting to the flames the intellectual garbage of the past. Hirschfeld's bust was also thrown into the bonfire, the only case in which a human image was also burned along with the books, according to historians George Moss and James Jones. Tossing the statue into the fire was a symbolic act, all right, but perhaps not the one that Joseph Goebbels intended. Because Hirschfeld's bust survived. The fire wasn't hot enough to melt it, and it was found and hidden by a street cleaner who donated it to the Berlin Academy of Arts after the war. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.